This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Let me begin this evening with just a few of the many highlights from last week's presentation by Professor Janet Brown of the History of Science Department at Harvard, who spoke on Darwin's Big Book and its ideas. Embedded, as you'll remember, within Janet's lecture last time were interesting answers to many of the enduring questions about Darwin and that big book. Number one, what was it that made Darwin's book so remarkable, the book we remember? No, it wasn't the first book on evolution, a point that Professor Siegel made our first night. There were a number of evolutionary thinkers in that era, a lot of continuity of thought, noted Janet Brown. Erasmus Darwin, Darwin's grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French scholar, Herbert Spencer, and Robert Chambers among them. But yes, Darwin's book was the first book to have a credible mechanism in natural selection, and no doubt that was important. Yes, it was supported by a mountain of evidence, in fact, 20 years worth of work behind the scenes. Yes, the internal logic was persuasive. You'll remember she quoted Darwin's own words saying, "The book was one long argument," and thus self-reinforcing. But Brown also suggested, and I thought it was a nifty insight, that Darwin had a special gift as an author, inviting us in, his ability to see others' point of view and develop a special personal relationship with the reader. Brown said, "On the Origin reads almost like a personal invitation. It invites you in. If you accept this, then it's not so difficult to accept that, and so on. It kind of brings you down the pathway to a point you agree or a point you don't agree." Said Janet, "It invites you to reconceptualize the world and our place within it." It had that invitational quality, I think, and that's one of the things that made the book so noteworthy. Brown gave another good reason, too. Point number two, Darwin's Big Book touched off one of the first great public controversies in science, the science and religion issue that we still talk about today, big then, a big issue today, at least in the United States. I like the way that Janet Brown put it. She said that people are disturbed by the materialism of it all. If we are natural beings, she said, what is the reason for our existence? That's a very deep and thought-provoking question. Noted Brown, this is a big deal. This is a big issue, a living phenomenon today. What is the reason for our existence? She noted that Darwin was lucky in his day to have a whole team of dedicated supporters on this debate on science and religion. As the debate grew in proportion, Darwin was there with a whole team of people to step in and help. She cited Asa Gray, Thomas Huxley, Charles Lyell, Ernst Haeckel in particular. There were also, she pointed out, a number of prominent and powerful critics, but as she noted, there was no unified attack. Very interesting. They sort of fought their battle one-on-one, and Darwin and his buddies were there to sort of meet the attack in almost a group-coordinated front. The critics included the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, Soapy Sam he became known as, he was so smooth. The prime mover behind the British Museum of Natural History, which set new precedents for public approachability of a museum, Richard Owen, who'd also helped Darwin to identify the fossils. And last but not least, Swiss-born zoologist and fish specialist Louis Agassiz. There's a lovely story about Louis Agassiz, a Stanford story that you all need to know. Evolutionists talk about it all the time, so this class needs to know the story. So I'm going to take a minute and run through this story. Agassiz lived in Paris early in his career, where he'd been a student of Alexander von Humboldt, the great explorer. He moved to Harvard, Agassiz did, in 1847, become professor of zoology, came across the Atlantic, founded the Museum of Comparative Zoology, a museum that's still very active today. Agassiz also taught on the side at Cornell, a non-resident professor, where David Starr Jordan, who went on to become Stanford's president, was his student. Jordan was later named Stanford's president in 1891. In part, through Jordan's influence, a statue of Agassiz has decorated the front of the quad ever since. So here we are approaching the quad in my slide up here. And I invite you all to do this the next time. Here's Agassiz as he looked in a sort of a black and white sketch. As you approach the front of Jordan Hall today, you'll see two, whoopsie, we don't mean to be doing that, two robust statues. On the right-hand side is von Humboldt. On the left-hand side here is Louis Agassiz. To this day, mark my words, out there in front of the quad. There he is, Louis Agassiz on the left-hand side. Close up, this is what it looks like. It actually says, those of you in the front might just pick it out, it says Agassiz right down here in the front on the little pedestal. All right, so the link is through David Starr Jordan. Von Humboldt was a teacher, Agassiz was a student, David Starr Jordan is a student in the same line, kind of an interesting little trilogy going there. Well, then came the big quake of '06. The big quake rocked San Francisco, the peninsula, of course, did this to the front of Stanford, and the statue of Agassiz went tumbling to the ground. Von Humboldt remained seated up there, looking down from above. David Starr Jordan, with great wit, he had two famous remarks that passed down through time among students and others. The first is every time he learns the name of a new fish, he forgets the name of a student, or vice versa. The second one is this wonderful one. He quotes a Stanford professor, Professor Angel, for whom I believe Angel Hall is named, passing by, observing this scene and saying to himself, gee, I always thought Agassiz was good in the abstract, but not very good in the concrete. You'll notice that he's still pointing in the direction of that he's headed there. And in any event, Janet noted that even Darwin's challengers and doubters engaged in this first big public debate of science and religion. And in the discussion last week, Professor Heller and Robert Proctor again emphasized that Darwin resonates today through his arguments about the relatedness of life, that finds even the challengers and the doubters are moved by this notion of the underlying unity of life, and they're challenged by that thought. At lunch, a third interesting question, I felt, from Professor Brown came up. Did Darwin delay the publication of his big book? And if so, why? I like the way Professor Brown liked to ask the question, did he delay? You know, let's not assume that he did. And if we convince ourselves that he did, why? She ran out two theories on this. First, that it was, yes, a delay, that it was deliberate stalling, avoiding a sense of danger. And second, that it was developmental, giving Darwin the time to make his arguments watertight. Danger because the idea of evolution threatened the hierarchy of the British Isles, threatened the fixed order. It was already a politically unstable time, a time of social discontent. She talked about the Chartists, she talked about radical movements, revolutionaries in the streets. No other scientific theory was dangerous in this way, sort of providing a rationale, an explanation for change, an explanation for things not obeying a fixed order, for not being constant. She gave the example in the lunch conversation of the vestiges of the natural history of creation, published anonymously in 1844. Now that's 15 years before Darwin's big book. A book that argued vestiges about progressive development. Everything in the cosmos developed from earlier forms. Solar systems and planets and everything developed from an earlier form. It sort of took Lamarck a step further, not using inheritance of acquired forms, but everything has the potential to evolve. Well, this book was roundly criticized for being radical, for challenging the order of things. It was taken as positive ammunition for Chartists and revolutionaries. People like the theologian Adam Sedgwick predicted, quote, ruin and confusion from such a creed, unquote. It will undermine, quote, the whole moral and social fabric and cause all sorts of deadly mischief, said Sedgwick. Vestiges was written by Robert Chambers, who went to extraordinary lengths to conceal his identity. His wife handled all correspondence. He was in the publishing business, and to protect his publishing house, he had a friend in the publishing business. He was based in Edinburgh. The friend was down in Manchester. The friend published the book, refused to identify the author, and for the rest of Chambers' life he remained the unknown author, afraid of the storm that would come to his publishing company and would damage he and his brother's business up there in Edinburgh. It's reasonable to assume, Brown said, that Darwin was anxious that his book would likewise mark him as a radical and bring a quick rejection. It was interesting, though, that heresy was not one of the charges, and Janet pointed out to us that to be charged with heresy, you must be an official in the Anglican Church, a vicar, and so Darwin could not be so charged. It was also interesting to learn that there's no evidence that Charles discussed his theories with his father, Robert, who lived until 1848, till way into Darwin's understanding and insight about theory and process. They clearly had deep discussions going into the 1840s about mind and body, on the nature of the soul, but no mention that they discussed evolution. Was Charles afraid? On the development side, just to finish the argument, the lunch focused on the barnacle period. Was the barnacle distraction Darwin's way of gaining the expertise to make his theory credible? Brown said Darwin planned to work but 2 months on barnacles. He had a favorite from Argentina. He wanted to place it, figure it out, and show how it was remarkable, document the homologies that it represented. He kept with barnacles for 8 years after that. Darwin held back a few specimens to work on personally, said Janet. He clearly had a personal inclination to work with organisms, to get in there and work. But more than that, she noted that a friend had written to Charles in the 16,000 letters that Janet Brown and colleagues have piled through, reading every word. A friend had written Charles in this period, suggesting that before scholars pronounce on species differences, they really, quote, should have worked with species beforehand in taxonomy, natural history, and so on. So the result is, I'm not sure we decided on the matter, or whether it was a deliberate delay or whether it was developmental. But in fact, the record shows that there was a 20-year gap. Quick reminders then, at the end of our session tonight, please don't forget there are a few more spots for lunch tomorrow. We're also taking sign-ups for Peter and Rosemary Grant, who will be with us next week, the scholars who work on Darwin's finches and Galapagos. Lunches are again in the conference room of Building 50 next to the church. The lectures are now appearing online at Stanford on iTunes U. And again, our format will be just as it always has been, following Professor Dennett's presentation this evening. The panelists will all come up, use the table here. We'll invite you to use the microphones, which are back in the middle of the auditorium. Again, please keep your questions to 1 minute. What's so neat about last week is the natural lead-in it provides to this week. The danger of the time, the danger of Darwin's idea, many of his ideas. It's only appropriate that we have with us tonight the author of Darwin's dangerous idea. Daniel Dennett is the Austin Fletcher Professor of Philosophy and co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. With a BA in philosophy from Harvard and a DPhil in philosophy from Oxford, he's taught at UC Irvine, moved to Tufts, where he has taught ever since 1971, aside from periods when he's visited at Harvard, Oxford, and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He's authored more than 10 books, 3 of them directly on the subject of consciousness: The Intentional Stance, Consciousness Explained, and Sweet Dreams, Philosophical Obstacles to a Science of Consciousness, published in 2005. He's the author of over 300 scholarly articles on various aspects of the mind, published in journals ranging from artificial intelligence, behavioral and the brain sciences, to Poetics Today and the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. He was co-founder and co-director of the Curricular Software Studio at Tufts and has helped to design museum exhibits on computers at the Smithsonian, the Museum of Science in Boston, and the Computer Museum in Boston. He spends most of his summers on his farm in Maine, where he harvests blueberries, hay and timber, and makes Normandy cider wine. Don't you love that? When he's not sailing or sculpting. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to Stanford Professor Dan Dennett.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks to all of you for coming out. This is a wonderful series. I'm honored to be part of it. As a philosopher, I have to live, as all philosophers do, with the realization that some of the most important thinkers that we philosophers deal with are philosophers who weren't philosophers. I wonder how many of you can identify these 5 excellent non-philosophers. We have Newton on the left, then Einstein, of course, and Freud. And then we have Kurt Gödel, the mathematician, and Alan Turing. Each of them in their way came up with ideas of tremendous philosophical importance, which we have to take seriously in large part because of their embedding in a large scientific framework. But the number one philosopher who wasn't a philosopher is, of course, Darwin. And when people see this picture, they sometimes think, well, gee, it looks sort of like somebody's coming. I don't know why people think this, but it's completely coincidental in any case. It's true that he is a hero of mine, but it's because of his dangerous idea and not any resemblance. Why was Darwin's idea so great? Because, I have argued, it united the 2 most ununitable, you would think, spheres of our experience: the world of purposeless causation, the world of physics on the one hand, with the world of meaning and purpose. From physics all the way to ethics, to poetry, to the highest realm of meaning that we have. One unified perspective. For that he needed one long argument, and he came up with it, and he had the empirical backing to make it stick. An early critic of Darwin summed it up. This is one of my favorite passages of criticism of Darwin. It's in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and I love to quote it. It's by a man named Robert Beverly Mackenzie. I don't think anybody knew for sure who had written it till I got some scholars sleuthing on this in England. It was published in the Athenaeum, which was sort of the New York Review of Books of its day in London. And here's what Mackenzie says. In the theory with which we have to deal, absolute ignorance is the artificer, so that we may enunciate as the fundamental principle of the whole system that in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. The caps are in the original. This proposition will be found on careful examination to express in condensed form the essential purport of the theory, and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who, by a strange inversion of reasoning, seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. Exactly right. That's it. And it is a strange inversion of reasoning. Well, how so? Because I think it actually overthrows an idea which is, in the sense, as old as the species. It might, in some sense, even be older than our species. Homo habilis, the tool maker, may have dimly had the idea that it takes a big, fancy, smart thing to make a less intelligent thing. That you have to have, if not absolute wisdom, you have to have intelligence to make something that's good in any way. You never see a pot making a potter. You never see a horseshoe making a blacksmith. Always the other way around. So deeply ingrained in our ways of thinking is this, so obvious does it seem, that it has been exploited by, for instance, creationist pamphleteers. A student of mine sent me a wonderful piece of propaganda. This is a page from a little propaganda leaflet that creationists have written. Do you know of any building that didn't have a builder? Yes, no. Do you know of any painting that didn't have a painter? Yes, no. Do you know of any car that didn't have a maker? Yes, no. If you answered yes for any of the above, give details. Take that, you evolutionist. And yet this is just the point. This is the inversion. Darwin is saying, yes, all the wonderful designs to be found in the biosphere were created by something which had no purpose, which had no foresight, by a purposeless and mechanical process. That is Darwin's strange inversion of reasoning. I want to augment it by pointing out that Alan Turing also had a strange inversion of reasoning, another extraordinarily valuable British mind of not so much later. And I'm going to put it in terms of Mackenzie's line on Darwin. So here's Darwin. In order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. And here's Turing. In order to be a perfect and beautiful computing machine, it is not requisite to know what arithmetic is. You see how one is, in a certain sense, the intellectual descendant of the other. They're very similar principles, and they fit together beautifully, as I will try to show. And Turing's was a strange inversion, too. It's brought out in a nice fossil trace. Here are some pre-Turing computers, the people. Before Turing, only people could be computers. And they had to understand what arithmetic was. They had to be trained mathematicians. Not today. Today, we have computers that aren't people at all and that don't understand arithmetic. They don't have to understand arithmetic. And of course, they can do a lot of things that aren't arithmetic, and they can do it all without understanding them. That's Turing's strange inversion. And just as many people can't abide Darwin's strange inversion, those are the creationists, there are a lot of people who can't abide Turing's strange inversion. And I've come up with a new name for them. I call them mind creationists. And among philosophers, there are two that come to mind particularly. John Searle is one, and the other is Jerry Fodor, who is a mind creationist. Here's a classic quote from Jerry Fodor. If, in short, there's a community of computers living in my head, there had also better be somebody who is in charge, and by God, it had better be me. I mean, Jerry has a great genius for coming up with a vivid phrase that captures exactly the proposition that is mistaken. It is Jerry's insistence that it cannot be, as it were, computers all the way up that marks his whole career as a sort of retrograde thinker about the mind. He has since, by the way, come out of the closet as a sort of creationist about evolution by natural selection. So he's both kind of creationists. A remarkable piece of his called Against Darwinism, published this year in Mind and Language with a response by me. And some of you may have read his bizarre diatribe in the London Review of Book called Why Pigs Can't Fly. But that's just an aside. I want to talk about Darwin's inversion and Turing's inversion and put them together. What we see here is a science cover from not so long ago. Let's see, it was 2003. And what the artist has done here is represented an artist's sketch of a myosin motor protein marching along on an actin highway. You've got trillions of these in your body. They're the little porters, the little robotic porters that move things around inside your cells. The reason this was on the cover of Science is that there had been a question of whether these porters, which clearly had two sort of little feet, did they move like an inchworm? Or did they go left, right, as they marched along? And some very clever experiments showed that they move left, right, not like inchworms. And this, by the way, there's some beautiful animations of these, computer animations of these on the web if you go hunting for them. Just go for myosin, M-Y-O-S-I-N, if you want to look for those. So we're made, in fact, of trillions of mindless little robots. You've got about 100 trillion cells composing your body. By the way, about 9 out of 10 of those aren't human. Our symbiont visitors outnumber our host cells by a factor of about 10 to 1. They don't weigh much. They're much smaller on average than their human cells. But that's sort of an amazing fact that most of the DNA in your body is not your human DNA. It's the DNA of your symbiont visitors that live there happily, mostly. We're made of trillions of mindless little robots. Not a one of them knows who we are or cares. But we know, we human beings, we know, and we care. How did that happen? How come? How did there come to be knowers and carers, thinkers like us, when this mindless process of evolution just produces, it seems, a lot of little mindless robots? In order to explain this, and that's what I'm really going to talk about tonight, we have to go back to relatively early days on this planet and the Eukaryotic Revolution. If we go back more or less 1.5 billion years, there were only prokaryotes on this planet. Bacteria, so-called blue-green algae, miscalled that, but at any rate, these were very simple cells. They had had roughly, well, almost 2 billion years of R&D to get where they were, but they were pretty simple. And then one day, an amazing thing happened. One prokaryote, A, entered another prokaryote, B. Now, question, was A invading B, or was B eating A? Well, when you're a prokaryote, it isn't so easy to tell. In fact, if B takes A apart and uses the parts, then B ate A. If A does that to B, then it's the invader. And if they live in harmony, they create the first eukaryotic cell. And what happened was, on at least one occasion, this is what happened, and the result, AB, was more fit than either A or B by themselves. They joined forces and created a new kind of thing. That was the Eukaryotic Revolution. And its fossil trace is very easy to read, even today. On the left, you see a simple prokaryote. You see relatively few moving parts. On the right, you see a eukaryote, and you see that those little yellow things, let's see if I can bring where's my, whoop, didn't mean to do that. Those little yellow things are the mitochondria. Those are the direct descendants of of one of the original prokaryotic invasions. They have their own DNA, quite distinct from the nuclear DNA of your cells. So every cell in your body is a eukaryotic cell. It's got its mitochondria, and they have their own genome. And it dates back 1.5 billion years, roughly speaking. Now these invaded eukaryotes are more talented, they're more versatile because they have more moving parts. And the great thing about those moving parts, and this is one of the great answers to the intelligent design crowd and to the people who think there's irreducible complexity. When that invasion took place, the new parts of the eukaryotic cells had 2 billion years of R&D that went into making them, giving them the talents that they had. These are not simple intrusions. These were things which already had a lot of competence of their own, so that you get a tremendous sort of technology transfer from this event. Now, here we see 2 sandcastles. And the question is, what's the difference between them? The one on the left is made by a single eukaryotic cell. It is made by an amoeba, Difflugia coronata. It is smaller than the period at the end of a sentence. It is its nest of sorts. Here's a picture of Difflugia coronata. There it is in its nest. So it turns out you can make quite an amazing structure without having a brain or a nervous system at all. That's how talented a eukaryotic cell can be. No prokaryote, no bacterium can do anything like that. They've got their own tricks, but they don't build houses. Eukaryotes had a versatility that permitted the division of labor, that permitted multicellular life. In effect, every living thing that is big enough to see with the naked eye is a multicelled creature made of eukaryotes. And the only reason multicellularity works is that eukaryotic cells have enough complexity so that they can diversify, they can have a division of labor, and they can become blood cells, bone cells, hair cells, brain cells, and all the rest. So this was an important innovation in the history of evolution. Now here's a fairly simple multicellular eukaryote, a Caddis fly larva. And here's something that it makes. A little fancier now than the sandcastle. This is a food sieve. And you notice you put it in a fast running stream, and the water goes in the thing at the top, and it flows through, and the food gets caught on the net there, and that's where the caddis larva can clean it up off the net. Very clever. It bears a certain striking resemblance to a lobster trap. What I want to do is ask the question of what's the difference between these two things. They're both artifacts. One is made by the caddis fly larva, and the other is made by a lobster trap maker, a human being. And in a nutshell, the difference is that there are reasons for the arrangement of the parts in the caddis larva's food sieve, but they are not represented anywhere. That caddis fly larva does not understand what it's doing. It does not have to understand. It's just designed to do it without any understanding of the reasons. There's brilliant reasons for the parts, for the shapes, for the way in which that whole structure is made, but the caddis fly larva doesn't have to understand those reasons. They are what I call free-floating rationales, in the sense that these are reasons, they're rationales for design elements, and they are not anybody's. They're not God's, they're not Mother Nature's, they're not anybody's, but Mother Nature, in the guise of the evolution by natural selection, is the process that created them and that tracks them. One of my favorite examples of this is the cuckoo chick. Cuckoos, as you know, are brood parasites. That is to say, the cuckoo mother does not hatch her own egg. What she does is she finds a host nest, some other species of bird, waits for those birds to build the nest and lay their eggs. Then when the host parents are off feeding, she drops down, quick, surreptitiously, lays her egg in the host nest, and then typically rolls at least one of the eggs out. This is in case the hosts can count. But she doesn't have to understand that. Really. And then, of course, when the chick hatches, and they tend to hatch, they have a shorter gestation time, so they hatch before the host eggs hatch. And the first thing they do is they try to push the other eggs out of the nest. It is quite stunning to see how these blind, featherless little hatchlings go about their dirty work. And in fact, let's see if we can make this work. I have a little clip here.
The cuckoo's egg looks like the warbler's, and the number of eggs hasn't changed. Everything appears normal, but appearances can be deceiving. Something is not quite right. One chick has hatched way before the others, and it is ejecting the remaining eggs.
Now, not very nice, huh? The little cuckoo doesn't have to understand the rationale of that. That rationale is unmistakable. Unmistakable what good this is for, what the purpose of this is. But the cuckoo chick doesn't have to understand this. Natural selection tracks reasons without representing them. It creates things that have purposes, but don't need to know them. In fact, The famous CIA need-to-know principle reigns in the biosphere. In spycraft, the need-to-know principle is there to protect against leaks, so that if a spy gets caught, the only information that they can torture out of him is the limited amount of information that he happens to know. And the principle is tell them as little as possible, only what they need to know to do their job. Well, that's not Mother Nature's reason for adopting the need-to-know principle. It's sheer thrift. In general, organisms don't need to know much. They just have to be designed to do a particular job. Notice that's Turing's strange inversion right there. They can be little robots that don't understand the rationale of the designs that they actually implement and utilize. So we put Darwin and Turing together. We get two strange inversions, and they're really complementary, and they work together to explain many features of the biosphere. But it doesn't stop there. I couldn't incorporate this film into my, for some reason, into my PowerPoint, so I just had to do it this clunky way. Some of you may have seen this Caledonian crow. It's got a little stick, it's a little wire, it's trying to catch a bucket with some food at the bottom of that tube of that clear perspex beaker. Can't get it. Yeah. So it takes the wire, wedges it in somewhere, moves around, gives a good tug. Now it's got a hook. Now, can it get it? Whoa, there. Pretty good. Oop, I want to go that one. What's the difference? Ruth Millikan, in her wonderful book of 2000, puts it very well. She talks about animals that represent their goals in the same representational system in which they represent their facts. Now we have the representation of purpose. Now we have the representation of reason for the first time. Now, one can argue about how much the crow really understands about the situation, and as usual, we can expect a sort of gradualist story to be told about the gradual increase in comprehension and versatility that goes into the nervous systems of these animals as we continue with the R&D processes of evolution. Now, it's a long way from the amoeba's sandcastle to the children's sandcastle. We are very, very different from other animals. This idea, human exceptionalism, inspires hot-button responses on both sides. There's the people who hate to hear it and who think it's something mysterious and false and anthropocentric in insisting on it. And there are those who think that anybody who denies it is a simple idiot. And here I am, in a way, taking sides, saying human beings are in a class by themselves in this regard, but there's nothing mysterious, there's nothing magical, there's nothing transcendental, there's nothing metaphysical about it, because I'm going to tell you the evolutionary story of how we got that different. And of course, it will be, in some regards, a just so story. I can't give you all the details, but it will not appeal to any magic or anything non-natural at any point. One of my favorite quotes is Darcy Thompson, everything is what it is because it got that way. And so now we have to see, how did we get that way? How did we become the reason representers? And I'm going to tell a biological story, but it isn't just about genes. That's what I want. That's the main message, of the take-home message of this. Now here's the tree of life. It may not look much like a tree to you. That's because we're looking at it. It's a bird's eye view of a tree, actually. We're looking down from above. The upper left branch is the bacteria. Those are the prokaryotes, and the archaea off to the right. And then this bottom branch is the eukarya, the eukaryotes. That can't be the next slide, is it? Maybe it is. Well, I guess we'll skip some of those other details. I cut them out in the interest of time. Here's a recent article by David Brooks in the New York Times. According to this view, human beings, like all other creatures, are machines for passing along their genetic code. We are driven primarily by a desire to perpetuate ourselves and our species. This sentence, which follows so naturally and nicely and familiarly here, I call the standard mistake. My main point is to say it's not the case. And in fact, it is importantly not the case. How can that be if we're products of evolution? And the answer is actually quite simple. We're the products of several different evolutionary processes. Oh, here we are. I knew those. I just had those out of place. So we have Luca, the last universal common ancestor, right there at the root of the tree. Not the first living thing, but just the most recent living thing that is direct ancestor of everything that's alive today. And you see on the eukaryotic branch, 3 species are out there at the end of the branches. It could have been drawn other ways. 3 close neighbors, of course, Coprinus, Homo, and Zea. Well, what are they? Well, Homo's us, of course. And Coprinus and Zea, well, that's mushrooms and corn. So we're actually, those are our cousins, all the mushrooms and all the corn. On the tree of life, we're actually quite close together. And of course, we're quite different, I think you'll agree, from both mushrooms and corn. And all of that difference has to be explained in evolutionary terms. Well, now that tree of life has had 3.5 billion years, roughly, to develop. Only 6 million years that we have had to evolve away from our common ancestor with the chimpanzees and the bonobos. So whatever differences there are between us and chimpanzees and bonobos have to have evolved in the last 6 million years, which is not a short time, but is a short time relative to all the time that evolution has been going on. And all the differences observable must be due to the R&D observed occurring in that interval. I use the term R&D very much on purpose because I see this as design work. This is improvement, lifting, changing in design space. It takes time, it takes money, or it takes energy, it takes time, just like R&D in industry does, and you don't get any of it for free. Now, that was 6 million years since we parted company with the common ancestor of the chimpanzee. Very important to remember that the chimpanzee has been evolving away from that common ancestor just as long as we have. It's not that we were chimpanzees and now we're Homo sapiens. It's that chimpanzees and Homo sapiens have both evolved from a common ancestor. And we've both, in one sense, evolved just as much, each of us. Now I want to shift the time scale up very dramatically just to the last 10,000 years. And this is a calculation that the late, great visionary engineer Paul MacCready made. He calculated that about 10,000 years ago, in the early days of agriculture, after agriculture had been established for a while, that the human population and the whole planet, plus the livestock and the pets, because there was already domestication, was approximately 0.1% of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass. That is, in common parlance, the animals. Doesn't include the insects or the worms, it doesn't include the fish. Terrestrial vertebrate biomass. It does include, of course, the snakes and the crocodiles and things like that. So we were relatively modest proportion of the animal life of 10,000 years ago. What do you suppose that number is today? What percent? Anybody hazard a guess? Somebody? 10%. 10%. 70%. Somebody knows, 98%. In 10,000 years. In 10,000 years, we've taken over the globe. Now, most of that is cattle and other livestock, but that is a stunning transformation of the planet, and it's happened in just 10,000 years. Creedy has a very eloquent passage about this. He says, over billions of years on a unique sphere, chance has painted a thin covering of life, complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. I love that image, painted, a thin covering of life. Suddenly, we humans, a recently arrived species no longer subject to the checks and balances inherent in nature, have grown in population, technology, and intelligence to a position of terrible power. We now wield the paintbrush. And we do. And we're the only species that has that power and that has that obligation. And that sets us apart from every other species. And what sets us apart is, of course, our technology and our intelligence. That's how we did it. Where did we get that? That's what the rest of my talk is about. So I want to first, though, to compare it in terms of suddenness. Steve Gould wrote a wonderful book, Wonderful Life, on the Cambrian explosion, which occurred actually over millions of years. That's sudden from the geological perspective. About 530 million years ago, that's when all of the new body plans emerged in the shallow oceans where life started. The first real exuberant radiation of, these are all invertebrate, but they were multicellular forms. Why that happens to this day, nobody knows. Many interesting theories. One theory, which I like, Andrew Parker's, is that the water got clear and eyesight evolved, and that set off an arms race between predator and prey because you had distal perception for the first time, and now you could play hide and seek, and basically all of the other adaptations that followed in their wake were driven by the fact that now there was vision. Interesting idea, it may not be true. So Steve Gould, in his book Wonderful Life, celebrates the Cambrian explosion, but it occurred over millions of years. The McCready explosion, if I may call it that, occurred in 10,000 years. That's about 500 generations. That's all. Just 500 generations. That's not much genetic time. It's not just genes. In fact, what it is that a second information highway from parents to offspring has evolved. In addition to passing on design, R&D through your genes to your offspring, you can pass them on through social learning, through enculturation, through imitation, through actual instruction. This is the second information highway. A nice book on how that got started is Pete Richerson and Rob Boyd's latest book called Not by Genes Alone, which I highly recommend to you. It'd be great additional reading for this course, by the way. Just as an aside, they published two books just about the same time. The other one is a collection of their scientific papers, which are quite heavily mathematical. And they realized that they should probably try to do a non-mathematical version, and this is it. And I know that they discovered that the task of writing this book actually clarified their own thinking. There were questions about the motivation of their mathematical models that they themselves weren't clear on until they tried to explain it in terms that didn't use the math. An interesting case where moving away from the math to try to do simple prose really was an increase in their own insight into their own work. Anyway, I highly recommend the book. What they point out is that once it gets, that there's actually some serious obstacles to the start of cultural evolution, but they work out pretty well, I think, how these obstacles could be overcome, the conditions under which cultural transmission should occur. And initially, it's from parent to offspring. So we have now a dual pathway of transmission. Things can go through the genes and they can go culturally. And there's some advantages and some disadvantages to this second highway. But it's a highway that has been optimized, pruned, fixed, rendered more efficient by many, many thousands of generations of genetic evolution, in the same way that the genetic highway has been optimized over billions of years of genetic evolution, so that we have proofreading enzymes and all this very elaborate machinery to preserve the fidelity of messages and so forth. That's an interesting story, but not time for it tonight. But once you get the highway up and running, guess what? You get oblique transmission, which is not just from parents to offspring, but from others, from somebody else's parents, or from the peers of the offspring, or from, strangers who mean you no good, who are out to exploit you in different ways. And it's this oblique transmission, which is sort of parasitic on this highway, that really changes everything and creates what Boyd and Richerson call rogue cultural variants. Rogue cultural variants are cultural items that move on this highway, get transmitted, and are not necessarily good for you. That is, they don't necessarily benefit the fitness of those that they lodge in. There's another name for those. They're what Richard Dawkins calls memes. Now, Boyd and Richerson are not real fans of the term memes, but they candidly admit that the main reason they don't use the word memes is because they didn't invent the term. But those of you who know about memes and who think that nobody but Dawkins and me and a few other people believe in them, no, Richerson and Boyd have very clearly allow for memes. They just call them rogue cultural variants. And there's some interesting work on that. So what are memes? According to Dawkins, they're analogous to genes or to viruses, which are naked genes. What's a virus? It's not alive. It's just a large macromolecule, really. It is, as I like to say, a string of nucleic acid with attitude. It's not alive, but it is certainly, it evolves. Classical evolutionary theory applies directly and unmetaphorically to it. The HIV virus has evolved more since it was first sequenced than we've evolved, than our genome has evolved since our parting company with the chimpanzee 6 million years ago. That can be clearly measured. So a virus can evolve, and a meme is like a virus. It's not alive, but it is something which can evolve. And what is it? Well, it's a data structure. It's an abstract sort of thing. So what I'm claiming is that the difference between us and other species is that we are, in effect, apes with infected brains. But the things that infect our brains are not little brain worms, although there are such things. The things that infect our brains are ideas. And these ideas are, in effect, virtual machines, to switch now to Turing talk. These are software devices made of pure information that can get into our brains and be replicated in our brains, and when they get in there, they can do things that the brain couldn't do without them. They're designed, in the first place, not by software designers, not by authors. They're designed by natural selection itself. This is pure cultural evolution. And these virtual machines give us powers which give us the versatility to take organization up a level. You notice the parallel now with the Eukaryotic Revolution. That was one of the great watershed events in the history of evolution on this planet. It made possible multicellular life. I'm suggesting that a similar evolutionary happening, the mimetic evolution, the mimetic revolution, created a new kind of thing, a euprimate, us. Our power depends on the culture that permits us to divide labor and to share expertise in a way that no other species can. My former student and dear friend, Bo Dalbum, once nicely said, you can't do much carpentry with your bare hands, you can't do much thinking with your bare brain. It's all the thinking tools that we add that give us that power. You need those thinking tools. And of course, primary among them is language. Fortunately, there's lots of thinking tools lying around. A little kid growing up is picking up thinking tools at a fantastic rate. Just words just roaring into the brain and lodging there and becoming little virtual machines that can now do new things. Well, where'd they come from? Who made them? Who designed all those neat thinking tools? Well, let's think about it a bit. First of all, a little exercise. Dogs are a kind of what? Well, they're a kind of mammal. They're a kind of pet. That's not such a hard question to answer. What are words a kind of? Words are a kind of sound? Nah. Sign? Yeah. Symbol? Yeah, but not very informative. What I want to suggest is words are a kind of meme. They are more particularly the kind of memes that can be pronounced. There are other memes that can't be pronounced. They're not words. There are other little virtual machines, little tricks, little habits, little software disposition setters that change the dispositional structure of the brains they inhabit, creating new behavioral possibilities. Ruth Millikan is a philosopher who has been arguing this way for years, although she didn't use the term memes. But way back in '84, she was writing about words as members of what she called first-order reproductively established families. This is the reproduction of words, not of the people that use them. This is the replication of words. Well, think about the diversity of words. Where'd they all come from? There are thousands of languages. Well, one question is, did all the languages have a common ancestor? Well, that's not a good question, as I'm going to show you, but the answer may be in a certain sense, yes. Let's think about it. We've had only 15,000 years to take us from the wolf to all of the varieties of domestic dogs, both the Great Dane and the Chihuahua. So under selection pressure, evolution can happen pretty fast. Linguistic evolution has had longer, and we can actually draw the family trees, the trees of life, if you like. Here are the Proto-Indo-European languages. Here are the Finno-Ugric languages, the languages of China, Proto-Mayan languages. There are these lineages of languages, and there's just no question that they have evolved over time, and that they've evolved by the differential replication of their parts. Some words go extinct, other words get copied, used, and they spread. And they even spread from language to language. Now, this is what a biologist would call anastomosis, branch joining, horizontal transmission. Now, in recent years, biologists have come to realize that in the early days of life on this planet, there was a tremendous amount of horizontal transmission, gene sharing between those early life forms, between the archaea and the bacteria and the eukaryotes, so that it just doesn't make sense to talk about lineages of species down there. You really have to talk about the genes themselves and the history of the individual genes, which move around in lineages, and that's the way words move. Think of all the words of English that have come to us from Russian or Italian or French or even Eskimo. Words are more trackable items in whole languages, and words have an evolutionary history, easily traced out. And actually, philologists and linguists, historical linguists, have been doing it for hundreds of years. So I want you to adopt the perspective of thinking of words as tools. Words are not always elements of grammatical construction. Since Chomsky, we have learned always to think of words as embedded in the system of grammar, of syntax. And that's all wonderful and true, but it's also true that words have a life of their own. Passwords, no syntax there. Labels, no syntax there. Imprecations, there's standalone uses of these tools, and we should bear that in mind. So what are they made of? Well, they're made of technique. They're not made of sound, they're not made of ink. They're made of something else. They are, in effect, there are little tacit recipes for action that you learn when you learn a new word. But they're not alone. Think about long division. That's not a word, it's a technique. What's it made of? What's cost-benefit analysis made of? There are lots of abstract things which are useful tools. Words are simply the most obvious. They are, in effect, virtual machines made of information. And these are the technology that's remade the brain and that make our minds. In a recent book, my friend and co-author and Stanford guy. His father taught here, and he lived here for many years as a child. Doug has at one point, he just lists some of the tools in his toolkit. These are all tools in your kit too. And what he wants to say about them is that each one of them gives him something to do with his mind that he couldn't do without it. It's useful for categorizing. It's useful for seeing similarities, for making analogies. So here are some of Doug's favorite tools. Not necessarily favorite tools, just tools. Wild goose chases, tackiness, dirty tricks, sour grapes, elbow grease, feet of clay, loose cannons, crackpots, lip service, one of my favorites, slam dunks, feedback. Each one of these gives you something you can do with your mind, with your brain, that you couldn't do without it. Who designed all these treasures that we share? Well, sometimes we actually can identify an author, an intelligent designer, and carve his or her name above the library in marble and honor the people that have designed particular items. But this is actually rare. It's just as rare as sometimes people coin words too. They deliberately set out to create a new word and get it to enter the language. Richard Dawkins created the term meme. But these are rare events, and they are not necessary. Each word doesn't have to have a coiner. Nobody designed language. Nobody designed tonal music, for instance. Did anybody invent the decimal number system? Did anybody invent the map? Did anybody invent money? All of those items are valuable cultural treasures that we all make use of, and they have no intelligent designers, but they are intelligently designed. They are brilliant for what they're for, and that design has to be the result of a process, and the process has to be, if it isn't an intelligent designer, it has to be differential replication. It has to be modification with descent. Now, when Darwin wrote the Origins, I don't know how much of this you're reading, but he starts off The Origin of Species very cleverly with methodical selection. This is deliberate, foresighted, intentional breeding of plants and animals by plant and animal breeders. Then he segues with unconscious selection. This is selection where human beings, just without knowing what they're doing, without thinking about it, they inadvertently domesticated plants and animals, and they weren't trying to improve the breed, but they were just favoring some animals in the litter over others, and over time these things accumulated. That's unconscious selection. And then he uses that as a segue. He says, in effect, you can eliminate the middleman altogether. You can have pure natural selection, where just the vicissitudes of nature, without any either conscious or unconscious helping hand from a human being, is playing the decisive role. And of course, today we can add a fourth. We can add genetic engineering, should be sort of up at the top there, which is a sort of hyper-methodical selection where we don't just wait for the mutations to happen, but we actually generate them in the lab. Of course, if you look closely at that practice, you find that they're using evolution by natural selection to do most of the generation there too, just sped up. Now, the same trio or quartet can be seen in cultural evolution. We have the natural selection of synanthropic memes. These are memes that are like rats and squirrels and pigeons. They're not domesticated, but they live well with human beings. They've evolved by natural selection. Nobody has unconsciously selected them. Nobody has deliberately selected them, but they're beautifully designed to live in our company and exploit features of us for their own benefit. There are memes that have the same characteristics. Nobody designed them. Nobody wants them. The same way nobody particularly cares about pigeons or rats, certainly, but they do very well, thank you. Then there's unconscious selection, such as the differential replications of tunes, what the Germans call earworms, a wonderful word for a tune you get in your head and you can't get it out of your head. Yeah. And then we have the methodical selection of domesticated memes. Just the way domesticated animals, let's take laying hens for a moment. They would go extinct if it weren't for help from the human hen keepers, because they've lost the broodiness. They won't sit on their eggs. If it weren't for the artificial incubators, they would never have any progeny. And we have memes that are like that too. Calculus comes to mind. Not exactly catchy. Not exactly something that is going to spread like wildfire through a community in spite of everybody's intentions to wipe it out. It has to be carefully nurtured and made to replicate with a lot of repetition. And then, of course, we have mimetic engineering, spin doctoring, advertising, sloganeering, the design of every scientific theory, try to come up with a good, unforgettable acronym which will then get replicated and so forth. What this permits is a certain sort of bootstrapping, which has worked in the past and can work in the again. I'm going to give just one simple example, and you can think about how to extrapolate from that. Yeah, almost. How do you make a straight edge? How do you make a straight line? Well, you get a straight edge and a piece of paper, you get a pencil, sharp pencil, and you just draw the pencil across the line, across the piece of paper. That's how you make a straight line. Where'd you get the straight edge? Well, from the straight edge manufacturer. And where'd the straight edge manufacturer get the straight edge? Well, from another straight edge manufacturer. They got an instrument there that's got some really straight edge. Where'd they get that? And you think about it and you realize that there has to be a history of technology of making better and better and better and better straight edges. And there is, and it's quite an interesting history. I looked it up when I got interested in this problem. I will spare you most of the details, but I want to show you a few examples. This is from a book published in the, I think, early 60s. And this is a box straight edge, and it's particularly, you can't probably read it. It's the best design. It's extremely rigid. Its form is self-proving, and it is relatively insensitive to temperature change. Well, if you want to know how good a straight edge can be, you can look at this graph. This shows the edge, the straight edge on a straight edge, which, as you can see, is not all that straight when you magnify it that much. But now look what's happened. We've had this bootstrapping where we make better and better straight edges and better ways of criticizing those straight edges. And now we have tools that can amplify and show the errors, and we can measure the errors. And we have the ideal of the perfectly straight edge, which we got by this process of bootstrapping. And we can approximate that ideal better and better, and even can measure its falling short of our Platonic ideal. And the reason we can do that is because we can represent our goals and how close we're getting to the goals and why we're doing what we're doing. We're not like the caddis fly larva. So the ideal of a perfectly straight line, what Plato might have called the form of the straight, was arrived at, in fact, by approximation, both of artifacts and of the idea itself. We have been able to criticize and improve this idea over time. And I'm going to say that without arguing it in detail, the form of the good that Plato talked about has a similar history. So what makes us human is our brain children, not our biological children. And we alone represent our reasons. We can think about our values, our reasons, and this is the source of our creativity. Because we represent our reasons, this is what enables us to devise moralities and not simply rely on the instincts that our genes may have provided, which may give us some help or may stand in the way. We can be critical of those very dispositions that are in our genes. We have become reflective and reflexive about the very design elements themselves. We can compare them, we can persuade each other. The word responsibility, as in moral responsibility, wears its meaning on its sleeve, I think. We are the ones that can respond. We can be challenged, we can be asked for our reasons, we can give our reasons, those reasons can be criticized, we can defend our reasons, we can sit down with others and engage in the unique human practice of mutual persuasion, and that is the source of both our morality and our culture and our responsibility. Remember, we're the ones that wield the paintbrush. And we know it. We've been told in words, and now we know it, and we're stuck with that responsibility. So back finally to the food sieve. What's the difference between that and the lobster trap? It's that we are the reason representers, and we now can look back, as we've been doing in the last hour, and discover the reasons everywhere in the tree of life. Now, it took Darwin to discover that a mindless process created all those reasons in the first place. And we are late arrivals. We're the intelligent designers. We're among the effects, not the cause, of all those purposes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dan, for that rip-roaring introduction to Anthropology 1. Dan Dennett discovers culture and the social sciences. Our first discussant tonight is Professor Hank Greely, the Dean F. and Kate Edelman Johnson Professor of Law. Hank is a leading expert on the legal, ethical, and social issues surrounding health law and the biosciences. He, in fact, specializes in the implementations and the implications of new biomedical technologies, especially those related to genetic, neuroscience, and stem cells. He frequently serves as advisor on California national and international policy issues, chairs the California Advisory Committee on Human Embryonic Stem Cell Research, and is a co-director of the MacArthur Foundation Project on Law and Neuroscience. He's also active in university leadership. He chairs the steering committee for the Stanford Center on Biomedical Ethics, in which I also serve, directs both the Law School's Center for Law and Biosciences and the Stanford Program in Neuroethics. He serves on the Scientific Leadership Council for the university's interdisciplinary BioX program. Before joining the Stanford Law School faculty in 1985, Professor Greely was a practicing law partner, served as a staff assistant in the U.S. Department of Energy, and as special assistant to the General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Defense, and once served as law clerk to Justice Potter Stewart of the U.S. Supreme Court. It is terrific to have Hank Greely with us tonight as a discussant.
Well, thanks, Bill. After that much too long introduction, you may be wondering why exactly I'm here to discuss Darwin's dangerous idea, and I'm kind of wondering that too, or I was wondering it when Bill first asked me. I think I've got some answers that I hope will be somewhat interesting, but a law professor is, I think, not the obvious choice to be a commentator here. Before I get into those, I just have to say that your comment about Anthro 1 reminded me that I took Anthro 1 37 and a half years ago in this very room, and I still shudder at the memory of George Spindler talking about the subcision right of the Arunta involving a sharp rock and a sensitive part of the male anatomy. So thanks for bringing that back to me, Bill.
That was a meme, a dangerous meme.
And it stuck, and I never took another Anthro course. Anyway, this is a fascinating talk and a wonderful book. I've had a hard time trying to figure out exactly what to talk about, but I think I'd like to briefly mention three things. Ways in which Darwin's dangerous idea might be usefully applied in social sciences and other areas of culture, including law. Ways in which they may well be misinterpreted and badly misapplied. And then finally, the cultural dilemma we've got with respect to what may be a strong resistance from even thinking about Darwin's dangerous idea, let alone applying it. So let me start first with Darwin's idea, the creation of design without designers, the doing of design work in bits and pieces, slowly over time, without any intelligence guiding it, which I take to be the core of your book. I was hired at Stanford to teach oil and gas law. And there's a long story behind that, and I've left it long behind, although it's wonderful, bizarre, interesting law. But I got interested in oil and gas leases, and I began to notice you could see how oil and gas leases evolved. You could see from different years new clauses getting in, or different sentences being added or subtracted, and variations from state to state. Every once in a while you could see why. A state Supreme Court decision had blessed a certain form of words in ways that oil companies like, so that form of words ended up in the lease. But over time, these leases became increasingly complicated, but also there was a homologous evolution here, increasingly similar to each other. And yet I don't think anybody could point at any one of them and say, this oil and gas lease was designed by this person. It was designed by a bunch of different authors who wrote bits and pieces of it over time, but it was also designed by all the company officials who didn't write it but decided to use it, and all the lessees who didn't write it but decided to sign it, and all the state legislators and judges who decided to allow it. And in a way, I think there's a lot of this cultural creation that goes on as a result of the same sort of unconscious, purposeless design with a bit of a qualification, because a lot of the people who took part in some of that may have thought they had a purpose. But even if they did have a purpose, that wasn't the purpose that led to its broad adoption. And another example from my law world, I work in law and biosciences, but I teach property and contracts because we're a teaching school at the law school. And so I talk about adverse possession law, the law that allows a trespassing neighbor to eventually own some land. I know where that came from in the United States. It came from England, because England had adverse possession law, and the dominant legal culture in the US is an English culture. Each state has a law with respect to adverse possession. Louisiana, with a French tradition, calls it something different, but it's the same thing. And they all evolved from that early English law, but they all moved in different ways. And not only did they move, but legislators, judges, deed drafters, surveyors, and others all moved, so that the large cultural construct, not just the words in the case books, in the textbooks, but the construct that is adverse possession and its effect on society, is, I think, another good example of design without a designer, design without purpose. But it's also interesting to think what makes these survive, what leads to different forms being used in Western states versus Eastern states. And we can speculate about that, and sometimes the speculations sound very plausible, but it's not clear to me that we can ever really answer that without being able to run a lot of very carefully controlled experiments, which in social science, at least in the law, you really can't do. So I think it's interesting to think about how this might be applied, and also to think about how a bunch of individuals, each of whom may have purposes, contributes to a change over time in a thing, but the change itself doesn't necessarily have purposes, or purposes that can be teased out. I don't think I've said that very well, but it's a combination of this kind of evolution, this dangerous idea, mindless design happens. It happens in areas where we think our minds are involved, and they aren't as involved as we like to believe they are. Second issue, and I think this is the one I care about most, a potential misuse of Darwinian ideas. The idea here that I have in mind is the idea of normality, of a result that evolution has produced that is the most common result, and for which people can often jump to the naturalistic fallacy and say, because it is, it must be right. And this ties in for me quite strongly with my concerns about misuse of behavioral biology or evolutionary psychology, the idea that our behavior is strongly guided by genes and by evolution. Now, I don't reject that idea in its entirety at all. And I think we have behaviors that are incredibly strongly genetically determined. The suck reflex of a new infant, for example. We have clear situations of genetic diseases that have behavioral components. I think the nasty of these is a childhood disorder called Lesch-Nyhan disease, where children by the age of 2 or 3 start chewing on their fingers and toes and mutilating themselves because they have an autosomal recessive disorder, they have no good copies of a particular gene. It is not in any particularly useful way thought of as the gene to keep you from mutilating yourself. It doesn't have a purpose, and that's not a purpose that it has, but the effect of having no good copy of it is these kids start mutilating themselves. It's a genetically compelled behavior. But when I look more broadly at the world, I see behaviors that plausibly are genetically encouraged, evolutionarily encouraged, like adult or at least post-pubertal men and women preferring to have sex with each other rather than other things they can't reproduce with, other things or people with whom they can't reproduce. That would seem to be a pretty sensible evolutionary thing to encourage, because the people who didn't have sex with people of the opposite sex wouldn't have children to pass on whatever genes they had. And yet, we see in every culture people who aren't so minded. They prefer to have sex with other people of their gender, or they prefer not to have sex at all. And how do they exist? Where do they come from? What worries me about a misuse of Darwinian thought is that Darwinian thought is taken completely, I'm sure, inappropriately, to have an end and a purpose and a meaning, and so what it produces is somehow right and normal, which then implies necessarily that anybody who doesn't follow that is wrong and abnormal. And I think we see that in a variety of ways. So I have a combination of a scientific doubt that in very many cases, something as complex as human behavior, which is so affected by the incredibly plastic and ever-changing brain. If you remember anything that's said tonight, tomorrow morning, it's because we have changed your brains. We have caused physical, chemical changes in your brain. I have a doubt that genetic evolution is likely to produce many very powerful, specific, highly penetrant behaviors. But leaving that to one side, what really worries me is a society that is always happy to try to find some way to say this is right, this is wrong. You can use the Old Testament, or you can use a pastiche of Darwin and say what evolution has produced is right, and then the consequence of that is anything that varies from your view of what evolution has led to, has produced, becomes wrong. Last point, I wonder how our society how our and other societies will deal with ideas that strike very hard, very much at the heart of what we think we're about. And Darwin's idea is certainly one of them. We like to think that we are special, that we were produced by someone who intended to produce us, someone, something, some process, even a teleological Darwinian process that ended up with us at the top of the tree of life. We like to think that we're special. Darwin's idea says no, there was no special, Darwin's idea says there was no special designer anywhere who decided that folks like you are the end product of the world, or what we really want, and that for the last 150 years has caused a fair amount of commotion and continues to. It's not the only offshoot of this idea that may be troubling, or relative, direct, or collateral of this idea that may be troubling, and Dan mentioned one of them, the idea, the reality, that we have 100 trillion cells, roughly. Some of us have bigger cells than others. Big-boned cells, husky cells. But we all have roughly 100 billion cells, and none of them knows that it's part of a person. There is a lot of interesting ferment right now through advances in neuroscience about whether we are conscious, what consciousness means, whether we have free will, what free will means. And I predict that that will prove at least as difficult for society to swallow as evolution has proven. What happens when science tells society something society desperately doesn't want to hear or believe? In the long run, we still don't know. We're still in the middle of that experiment with the Darwinian story, at least in the United States. Maybe next November 4th we'll provide one more step toward an answer to that question. But I think these issues, these changes in perspective on the universe and our place in the universe will really be quite challenging for our society to try to digest, and quite challenging to the relationship between science and society. And in a way, that to me may be the most interesting thing to watch for, and I hope to try to influence over the next few years, both with evolution and with neuroscience. I'm done.
Thank you, Hank. Our second discussant this evening is Chris Bobonich, Associate Professor of Philosophy and, by courtesy, Classics.
I've been promoted. I'm now a professor.
You're a professor.
I was promoted.
Congratulations.
Wonderful. Congratulations. We should celebrate that right there. Professor Bobonich has a PhD from Berkeley and taught at the University of Chicago before coming to Stanford in 1996. He's the author of Plato's Utopia Recast from Oxford University Press in 2002. He received the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching, and in 2005 was named Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, recognizing his exceptional commitment to teaching and mentoring undergraduate students. A recognized authority on Plato, his main area of research is Greek philosophy and the history of ethics. His recent courses include graduate seminar on Aristotle's ethics, seminar on Plato's metaphysics, and then epistemology and freedom, Plato's metaphysics and epistemology, and freedom and eros in philosophy and art. Chris, welcome.
Thank you. And you'll know that now I'm a full professor, my arguments are yet valider.
Pull the microphone closer,
be.
Chris.
Okay. First, and I'd like to congratulate Professor Dennett. This is truly a marvelous, wonderful, engaging book. And like pretty much all contemporary philosophers, and I've learned a great deal from Dennett's work over the years, not on simply on evolution, but on other things. And there are certain points that I'd like to hear more about, and so I'll turn to this. And the title of the book is Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And Dennett makes a very compelling case and of how dangerous Darwin's ideas are in many ways. And a quotation from page 18. Darwin's dangerous idea cuts much deeper into the fabric of our most fundamental beliefs than many of its most sophisticated apologists have ever admitted, even to themselves. And so following some of Professor Greely's remarks, I'd like to hear a bit more about Darwin's implications for morality. I'd particularly like to hear a bit more about this, since I'm sure an enormous amount of nonsense has been written about Darwin. Quite possibly the greatest amount of nonsense has been written about Darwin and morality. And Professor Dennett's views in chapters 16 to 18 are refreshingly subtle, nuanced, and cautious in the implications of what they have about Darwin for morality, or in other words, I agree with most of these claims. Let's begin by granting that Darwin provides problems for forms of morality and that depend on a providential designer God. This, I think, is more or less true. A minor quibble, David Hume's discussion of the argument from design suggests that there's surprisingly few actual ethical or normative implications of accepting even a designer God, and that is something in some way or another analogous to intelligence. And we could give that away, accept that, don't have to, but we could accept that. And yet the implications for ethics, I think, are going to be pretty small. One form of view about the nature of morality is a view called moral realism. Moral realists think that moral properties, ethical properties, are out there, and they're part of the fabric of reality in the way that we typically think, say, mass is or charge is. And so they're realists about moral properties. One reason, and so what does Darwin have to say in connection with that? And one reason for not accepting the view that there are moral properties out there as part of the fabric of the reality in the way, say, that mass is that it's hard to see how we could acquire knowledge of them. And they don't seem to come through the senses. How then could we acquire knowledge of them? What mechanism puts us in touch with ethical facts? And there's a second problem with ethical facts, as a philosopher named John Mackey said, and they seem to be queer facts, and that is they tell us what to do and how to act. Various other facts don't tell me how to act, and the fact that this might be poisoned, suppose it's poisoned, and doesn't tell me to drink it or not to drink it. It depends on other desires that I have, intentions that I have. Ethical facts seem to tell me what to do. So they're queer facts in that regard. How could there be such facts? And so here naturalism, and that is an acceptance of the methods and principles of science in order to establish what there is, in order to establish what really is out there in the world. And this seems to be enough for this worry about moral facts. It seems to be enough to generate this worry about moral facts, and we don't need the sophistication of Darwin's biology to do it, and very old-fashioned views such as Epicurus, it seems, is going to do that well enough. And some have argued that we can show that ethical properties really do some work in explaining the world, and if so, they will claim that by inference to the best explanation, and we should posit their existence. And if true, Darwin, if there were compelling evidence for this, Darwin, I take it, wouldn't block us from this. And so Darwinism seems to have relatively few direct implications for something like moral realism. And it's worth, I think, to try to be clear about what the ethical implications of Darwinism, and simply because Dennett is so much more careful in the claims that he makes than the social Darwinists and some sociobiologists, some behaviorists, and some doing evolutionary ethics that he talks about and calls, and I think a really lovely phrase, greedy reductionists. That is, those who crudely derive ethical conclusions from naturalistic facts, as Professor Dennett argues in the book, compellingly, and mentioned in the lecture. And there's no doubt some story of how our genes, beliefs, thoughts, and environment interact to get us here. But that doesn't show that all our norms are for the sake of our genes, or that some people don't really accept ethical principles. And it doesn't show that people are acting for the purpose of passing on their genes. And people do all sorts of things, and if we try to explain why, then typically we invoke their beliefs, their desires, and we adopt, say, the intentional stance towards them. And evolution doesn't tell us that that explanation has to be in terms of passing on their genes. And so, what does Darwinism itself, and as opposed to, say, naturalism or empiricism, tell us about what view we should take of moral principles? And consider, for example, the view of nihilism. Nothing's right or wrong. One way to put it is that all moral claims are false. And as you might think, all claims about Santa Claus are false. Santa lives at the North Pole, false. Got a beard, false. Just straightforwardly false. And you might think this is true of morality as well. Dennett is concerned to argue that Darwin doesn't entail this. And as far as I can see, he's right about this. As far as I can see, Darwinism is pretty much neutral and on the nihilist, non-nihilist debate. On the other hand, there are theories called best considered opinion theories. How do we decide what principles we should adopt? Well, we examine cases and consider intuitions about principles, try to decide what favorable circumstances are for making judgments. Usually my logical judgments are better when I'm not drunk. My judgments about other things are better when I'm not mentally ill. And then we hold that they're normative or evaluative principles are the things that we hold in these conditions. And you might think this is true for principles of reasoning, not just morality. And here again, Darwinism seems just neutral. And so I'm wondering if we share that view. Finally, Dennett seems a little bit more optimistic about evolutionary game theory. and I'd like to hear a little bit more about this. I can think of one way, and you suggest one way, which I think does give us some grounds for optimism, which is this. And certainly evolutionary game theory might offer us some recommendations about what kinds of rules to adopt. And it can show really quite rigorously that certain strategies with respect to cooperation, if followed by all, will lead to disastrous outcomes thanks to its mathematical sophistication. It can show if adopted by a certain percentage of the time, it leads to certain outcomes. And this is actually really quite important, since ethical principles are often supposed to be followed by everyone. So it's often nice to see what would happen if all cooperate or a certain percentage do. And this seems to be more of a fact about cultural evolution rather than using game theory as a way of thinking, for example, about the fitness of various kinds of individuals. I'm more concerned and somewhat less convinced, and I actually don't think Professor Dennett endorses this, that game theory, evolutionary game theory, can help explain why such rules developed and persisted. An explanation of particular historical events that includes such complicated things as beliefs, desires, unconscious impulses, and so on, and will require anthropology, history, psychology, and economics, it seems, to name just a few, and lamentably, and compared even with the rather infirm natural sciences such as weather prediction, and anthropology, history, economics, and psychology don't seem to be in very good shape in offering predictions or compelling explanations. So should we have much confidence in the idea that evolutionary game theory gets the historical details right, and how could we verify the claim without the sorts of theories mentioned above? There are also the obvious worries about committing a naturalistic fallacy, but we've talked often enough about that. So in sum, and I don't think you have to believe in skyhooks, other than those practiced by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, to be quite agnostic about Darwinism's ethical implications. So I would just like to hear Professor Dennett talk more about this.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, there's a lot here, and I will. Is this microphone on? I guess it is.
Just pull it up close. Keep it up close.
There's a lot to talk about, and I think some of you may have questions, so I will try to be short-winded. First, Professor Greely, thank you for very useful comments. You made a point I just want to underline. There are many areas in human social affairs and in human society where we simply cannot do the experiments. And because we cannot do the experiments, we may even forever be unable to gather the sort of evidence that would be required in order to confirm or even strongly support some of our theorizing, Darwinian theorizing. And I think we just have to acknowledge that that's a real possibility, and then, of course, theory becomes a sort of structure that's cantilevered out over the messy details in a way that may illuminate it, but we should be careful that it may run into some. We may be fooling ourselves if we take the theory as too illuminating of the messy details. I think that's simply just a fact of life in the social sciences, and it neither disqualifies evolutionary or Darwinian perspectives on the social sciences, and it certainly doesn't suggest there's any better way of finding the patterns and regularities and finding the explanations. So I don't think that's grounds for concern, but I think it's very important to recognize that point. And I also agree with you about the potential misuse of Darwinian thinking. I think no great idea is more abused and more enthusiastically misused than Darwin's idea, and that's one of the things that makes it dangerous. And I think we all have to be on the lookout for that. At the same time, I think we must not make the mistake, although many people in the humanities and social sciences in particular are eager to make this mistake, they don't think it's a mistake, to shun evolutionary thinking altogether on the grounds that it can be misused. That is just stupid. And yet there are many people in the humanities and social sciences, as soon as you say the word evolution or Darwinian, they reach for their gun, they don't want to hear it. They are adopting a sort of ostrich attitude toward the field, and I think that is, inexcusable. I'll leave it at that. And there's a lot of inexcusable, indefensible evolution phobia out there that we should simply note it and then persist. Politely, if possible. Professor Bobonich, the implications, he's concerned about the implications for morality, and I'm glad to hear him say that he finds me walking carefully and subtly through these minefields and trying to avoid the greedy reductionism and still come up with what the implications are. Let me comment briefly on just a couple of points that he brought up about philosophical schools of thought, which I think might find some illumination from thinking in the Darwinian way about them. The moral realists who think that moral facts are sort of like mass or charge, I've never found that the least bit plausible. It seems to me quite obvious that moral facts are much more like arithmetic and logic and for that matter chess. They are facts about abstractions that are interesting and valuable in various ways. And here there's a really interesting debate running in philosophy. I would say that Bob Brandom is the philosopher who has, I think, worked hardest to try to characterize the notion of norms that he sees as central to not just to ethics but to all discourse. And the question is, where do these norms come from? And he comes up with a delicious and clever idea that they come from community, and there's a sort of bootstrapping. We give them to each other. The whole process of evaluating reasons and give and take is somehow self-supporting. Clever idea. I just don't think it works at all. Mm-hmm. Because you have to, how did it get there? And why? This is a lot of effort going into this. There has to be a Darwinian explanation of how there come to be communities that do this in the first place. These activities, however self-sustaining they may become, have to grow somehow. There have to be reasons why people start doing them and why these things persist. And I like to point out that there's plenty of normativity. There are plenty of norms that arise right within biology itself. Every biological process has been tuned by evolution. This is the best way it could be done. It's like engineering, and there are engineering norms that are being honored and displayed and tracked. That's what all those free-floating rationales are. They are reasons why this is the right way, why things are this way, rather than some way which is not as good for this purpose. So, to put it sort of in a cute and vivid phrase, evolution gives you the norms. Well, society gives you some norms. Evolution gives you some other norms. Roughly, it's the difference between when you don't do it right, are you being naughty or stupid? Evolution gives you the norms where when the falling short is called stupidity. Society gives you the norms, the falling short is called, in effect, moral naughtiness. And if you can see the difference between being naughty and stupid, then you sort of see the distinction that's at work here. The task for a naturalist is to show how we get naughty out of stupid. Mm-hmm. That is, how we build a bridge, a structure of process to get us from the purely engineering norms which evolution has in abundance. It is not a norm-free world. How we get from that to moral norms, and not just cultural quirks, like which side you put your fork on, but how we get to norms that have a genuine claim on our adoption, on our rational acceptance of them. Now, I'm trying to argue that, in fact, the evolutionary story, and I gave you a very quick sketch of it here today, of cultural evolution, shows how that bridge comes to exist and how we maintain it. Now, in the old tradition of the pre-Darwinian tradition, we had what we might call the trickle-down theory of meaning and goodness. Nothing could mean anything. Life could have no meaning. Acts could have no meaning. Things couldn't be right or wrong unless they were endowed from on high with that meaning in the trickle-down theory, from a higher power, from a higher good. What Darwin does is completely inverts that and says, no, the most important norms we have to bubble up from below. And they are none the worse for that. The fact that our norms are the norms that we, mere human beings, just primates on a planet, that if we can come to consensus about what these norms are, what could be more important than that? How could any transcendental fact or any higher power endorse that in a way that would matter to us more than the fact that this was our creation? So that we should allow the Darwinian strange inversion to continue right through ethics as well. And that's where people, I think, get very anxious. They can see, and those philosophers have talked about this for centuries, that there's something deeply unsatisfying with the sort of chicken-egg problem of, does God command it because it's good, or is it good because God commands it? So we just don't throw that one out. It's just not going to help. And think that our ultimate convictions about what's right and wrong are going to have to come from the best bootstrapping thinking we can do about what we ought to do and why. Everybody gets to contribute to that communal discussion. And it's a political process. It's not a scientific process. It's a political process, and that's the best we can do, and it's good enough.
Dan, I'm going to have to jump in and...
Andrew?
Okay, good. We need to have some time for your questions. We have about 10 minutes, and would love to hear questions that you have. Since I don't see people sprinting, students, come on, let's have some questions. Dan, I have a question for you while we're waiting for people to get to the microphone. I really enjoyed your masterful production tonight, and I enjoyed also many of the takeaway lessons. But I found it fascinating that your evolutionary story of cultural evolution leaves out the history of cultural evolution, the concept of it. It's as though it appeared from Boyd and Richerson's book. It's as though it appeared from Richard Dawkins' meme. There's a whole long history in social science. I would trace it back to the work of Donald Campbell in the 60s. I would trace it back to the human biology program at Stanford. In spring of 1970, human biology faculty in auditoria like this one came to the front of the room and they said, in the history of life, there have been two really important events: the flow of information through nucleic acids and the flow of information by human language. And our challenge is to understand this dual inheritance system. We've come a long way since the spring of 70, and it's not like it just appeared with Dawkins or with Boyd and Richerson. In fact, Stanford's been, with the work of Cavalli and Feldman and the human biology program and so on, I would just say, don't leave the history out of your evolutionary story. It's really important and really lively. Sir, you had a question.
Yes, does this work?
Yep.
I'd be interested to hear from Daniel Dennett or anyone else on the panel about your thoughts on the evolution of God.
Of God?
Yes, the idea of God as a meme.
Yeah. Well, as you may know, I've written a whole book about that. My most recent book, Breaking the Spell. And to put it in just a couple of sentences. The origins of the meme for God started with superstitions that started simply as accidents of the hair trigger firing of the "who's there" instinct when something surprising happens. This is the hyperactive, one of the hyperactive agent detection device idea. The idea that if you're in New England and you're in the house in the winter and the snow falls off the roof and your sleeping dog jumps up and growls and he hears a noise, that's the response. The dog isn't just saying what happened, saying who's there. The dog is on the lookout for an agent because there might be one. We have the same instinct, but in us we don't just growl. We start looking around for agents. And this is, I think, the ultimate source for all the menageries of invisible sprites and demons and goblins and gods and fairies and gremlins and leprechauns and all the rest. And the ones of those that are really unforgettable for various reasons, those are the synanthropic memes that are the ancestors, and eventually they get domesticated, and that's where we get religions from. That's where the ideas of gods comes from. And there's a much longer story, but that'll do for the start. And as we've domesticated these ideas, they've, of course, just like our domesticated animals, they've taken on all sorts of properties that are, as it were, not so much for their benefit as for ours. And some of this has been deliberate, and most of it hasn't been.
But could you explain from this hyperactive agent detecting device how we generate the diversity of notions of the supernatural? From a constant instinctive device, how do we generate, and I'm sure you can do it through the cultural evolutionary mechanism, because that's how anthropologists would do it, but how would you generate from a constant instinct the diversity of answers and properties of the answers that are given by human notions of God?
Oh, I think there's no problem there at all. I think it's easy. I think diversity of that sort is just is the default. It's what's going to happen unless there's really serious pruning forces, because it's the amplification of accident, which is what happens in evolution all the time. Evolution is about things that almost never happen. Mutation almost never happens, but evolution depends on it. Mutations that are actually benign, that are actually fitness enhancing, are the rarest of rare, but evolution depends on it. Everywhere you look, evolution depends on events that almost never happening, but then starting something which then builds on that. And in this case, all it takes is, let me just postulate, 10,000 occasions when people have been sort of out in the woods and a little bit freaked out when walking along with a companion, and something rustles, and one of them says, "Oh my God, what was that? Was that tree? That tree? I could have sworn that tree spoke to me." What? There's no such thing as a talking tree. Well, I don't know. It sounded like a talking tree to me. No, trees can't talk. What's happened? Talking tree, talking tree, talking tree. It's already had 4 generations in 10 seconds. They go back to the village and say, "You know what? He thinks it's a talking tree. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard." Pretty soon everybody's talking about the talking tree. That's a synanthropic meme. Now, what happens is that every culture has bunches of those. And first of all, of course, notice that 99 times out of 100, when somebody gets freaked out in the woods, they don't come back with one of these. It just fades out. It's a lineage that never went anywhere. They had a momentary start, nothing happened. Every now and then one of them kindles, and then you get the talking tree, and that's got to compete with the river god and the bird who sings the special note and all the others. And pretty soon each area has its own local menagerie of unforgettable and hence replicable memes that are passed among themselves, and then groups get together and they compare notes, they spread their memes around, and we've got all of these thousands of ideas that are vivid, they are sort of unforgettable, they're the sort of thing you want to pass on like an urban legend, and those don't depend on any human stewards to take care of them. You don't have to have protectors of these memes. They'll take care of themselves. They're catching, they're infectious. And out of them, however, gradually emerges the gods of religions. After all, there have been probably millions of religions that have died, after living for a few weeks or decades. And all we see today are the hardy survivors of that process.
And I just add a historical note. I agree entirely with Dan. I think avoiding diversity of religion is pumping the ions upstream. I mean, that takes the work. When in the Reformation, the power, both cultural and legal, of the Catholic Church shattered, the result within a few years was hundreds of different Protestant sects, some of which are still with us, having generated their own subsects and subsects and subsects. Yeah. So I think historically we do see religion proliferating and diversifying whenever it has an opportunity.
And then there's this other factor. Lovely bon mot from the meeting I was at just a few days ago in Chicago. Jeff Charlotte, who said, you've been traveling around the United States talking with sects and cults of various sorts. He says, people say that there aren't many gods in America these days. He says, no, there's thousands of different gods. It's just that they're all called Jesus.
A few hundred who aren't.
We have time for one last question. Anybody have? Sir. Bob.
It's not sir.
Well, thank you. Son. Thank you all for your presentations. You just gave us a very nice sort of theoretical explanation for the existence of religion. If you look at the accumulation of scientific knowledge, it's increasing at a geometric rate. It's increasing at an increasing pace. It seems that people find it anathema to think about things that we don't actually understand now. And so is it possible that there's a perfectly good scientific explanation for religion, but we're not even close to getting to the groundwork that we need for understanding it? People just don't, my sense is that nobody wants to admit there's things that are scientifically explicable, but we're not quite there yet.
Of course it's possible that we're way off base with the current theories. It's not as if we have an embarrassment of riches already for accounts of how religion arose and what its survival value is and so forth. The one thing that I want to ward against, I think the main reason I wrote Breaking the Spell was, and I would talk to people about, I said, I'm writing a book about the evolution of religion. People say, oh yeah, well, what do you think religion's for? I mean, it's got to be for something, because after all, every human group that's ever been studied has something which is clearly identifiable as religion. What do you think it's good for? And I said, well, you might be right, but you're jumping to a conclusion. Every human group that's ever been studied has the common cold, too. What's that good for? It survives because it can. That's the level playing field. We start there. Then we can start asking, which of these cultural forms which survive because they can, which of them are actually benign and beneficial and fitness increasing, and which of them are parasitic, and which of them are mutualist? And that should be an empirical question. We shouldn't jump to the conclusion that they're all going to be mutualist. You've got to remember, as you sit there, you've got trillions of symbiont visitors. Most of them are neutral, thank goodness. Some of them you couldn't live without, like the flora in your gut, and some of them are pernicious. And the same thing should be true of culture. We should expect there to be lots of memes that are of no good to you at all. They're not fitness enhancing in any way. They're just good at hanging around, and it's not easy to get rid of them.
On that note, let me thank all of our speakers tonight, Hank, Chris, and Dan Dennett.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.